Welcome to the Author Blurb podcast. I'm your host, Eric Maynard. So today I'm speaking with Peter Rosch. Very interesting, gives a lot of deep details on all the events in his life that led him to create the novels he did. At first, you might sit and say, okay, this doesn't sound like the book for me, but once you dig into listening to what he has to say, listening to all the different things that he discusses in his book, if you like thrillers and you want to find a different type of story to get into, something that might make you question or wonder something that you're not used to, you might really be interested in listening to what Peter has to say. I enjoyed our conversation with him. He was very intriguing and had a lot of stories and information that I just haven't dealt with personally. So I found him interesting myself. You can always find him and, of course, all the other authors I've had on the show and will have on the show at authorblurb.com. I always encourage everyone to go there, visit the site, find the articles that some of the authors have written, find different things that might interest you, find the shows. You can always find where they're streamed, where they're playing in video, and about anything else. You can also reach out to me there. So I appreciate you being here. I always appreciate as much as I can to have you join the show and let me know what you think. You can send me a message through authorblurb.com. You can reach out to me however you want by possibly just giving me a rating and review. That lets me know if you like it as well. And I always love seeing those. So with that being said, authorblurb.com is the place to go. And now let's get into the conversation with Peter Rosch and go from there. Thank you. Enjoy. So I'm here with Peter Rosch, and as a author of thrillers and horror, he's a 3-time author, I believe award-winning, I saw. Peter, I appreciate you being on here. I'm going to just hack up like I do most times with anything when it comes to trying to talk about other people's books. Can you tell me a bit about yourself, about your books, and then we can start learning a bit more about everything?
Absolutely. Well, you said my name correctly, the last name. I usually tell people it's just like cockroach. Just throw the S in there. And yes, I do declare myself an award-winning writer, but I'm also very transparent that the awards that I've won have been for writing advertisements mostly. I've had a pretty long career in advertising, and I don't think I've actually won anything except the respect of my wife, maybe, when it comes to writing novels. But when you're trying to create that catchy eye blurb, you just you rely on everything that you can pull from. So it's not untrue, but it's not wholly true as it relates to the books. I have written 3 novels. I call them novels. I think there's a lot of there's new words developing every day to describe where literature fits within the spectrum. Are they novellas? They certainly would have been considered novel length back in the day, but I'm growing increasingly aware that the publishing industry at large kind of has it in their mind that something has to be 70 to 90,000 words maybe to even be considered a novel. But we'll just call them books. 3 books. I've written 3 books.
There you go.
Yeah, and the first one I published in 2012. It's called My Dead Friend Sarah. The second book I wrote and published was in 2014. It's called But I Love You. And my most recent book, the book that I hope to talk a little bit about with you today, is called Future Skinny. And I published that. That came out in May of this year. So I am a guy who has written a lot of stuff, probably stuff that maybe you've seen or some of your listeners may have seen in terms of advertisements. That's not why I write books. It's just I mean, I fell into writing ads. That is in and of itself a very long story, but I'll just tell you, it was not my intention to go work in the advertising industry. But when I graduated from college, I had taken a trip to New York City. I wanted to move to New York City. I had a degree and a portfolio in writing for advertisements, and that was the quickest way to get to New York. Hey, take a job in New York City, find an ad agency to work for. I honestly, I had designs on being a musician. I play the drums, I play the guitar, I played in bands most of my life, and I really thought that that's where I was headed. But once I got up there, you know, advertising is in of itself very fun, very demanding, can be anyway, and that became really my thing for a long time. I did not write outside of that. I did not play music. It kind of took over. Along with my, you know, alcohol. I'm also a recovering addict and alcoholic. I'll have 14 years sobriety this October. And you know, those two things early on, the writing and advertising and alcohol and drugs, they kind of really pushed me for a long time. And I did a lot of amazing things despite all my best efforts to destroy my life and ruin it. And so, you know, my adult life really has two kind of chapters, two large chapters, I guess, or two parts, and that's pre-sobriety and post. I wouldn't actually sit down to write a book, my first book, My Dead Friend Sarah, until I was sober and I had a couple of years sobriety under my belt. And it probably therefore is no surprise that even though My Dead Friend Sarah is a thriller and a piece of fiction, it actually deals heavily with a guy who is recently sober, and kind of revolves around those themes and certainly things I was dealing with at the time. Although it's actually about the story about a guy who habitually dreams about a woman who's gonna be abducted, and then lo and behold, he actually sees her on the street one day, and you know, decides that it's really on him to befriend her and warn her that something's coming, and it kind of goes from there. Anyway, it's called My Dead Friend Sarah. A lot of people, I think, you know, they think it's going to be a ghost story.
Right.
You learn pretty quickly when you're, you know, putting out books, what a title can do. I will say that title, My Dead Friend Sarah, actually was very effective in catching people. And my wife, who's an amazing designer, she actually did the cover for that book. And I think the title and the cover itself drew a lot of attention. But man, I'll tell you what, when people are expecting to read like a romance about some ghosts, and that's not what they get, and they get
Right.
a story about a guy who's kind of crazy in the head, and there's a lot going on, obviously, as I said, about addiction, you'll get some 1-star reviews. You will.
Oh,
You
right.
definitely get some people who are like, I thought I was going to read a story about some ghosts who fell in love. I've always been a writer. You know, like I said, I mean, I ended up in advertising. That wasn't what I wanted to do. I wrote when I was a kid. I liked telling stories when I was a kid. You know, I noticed that, you know, one of the questions that you ask often and sent along to me in advance was like, why do you write? And I have thought about that so often, because I kind of wish I didn't want to write sometimes, you know.
Well, I tend to find, like, one thing you said is in the information you sent me was that you write, one thing is you include your demons and all that stuff in your writing. So let me ask this then. So your first novel, My Dead Friend Sarah, so you said that's about where a guy is dealing with his demons, his alcoholism, recovery, all this stuff, right?
Yep.
And I've known quite a few people through my lifetime that's been heavily in drugs, recovered from it, I know people that just disappeared because they got so big into drinking that they fell off the map, and I don't know anything of them at this point. So I do understand how the demons of addiction can really affect somebody in that way, especially my hometown, which is a small little farm town area. Drugs have become very bad there. How did you find that the writing actually helped you face those demons, or in your first book, where did you take and deal with those demons to pull out for your book?
Well, first off, I mean, I appreciate you sharing that. It is amazing to me how much alcoholism and addiction touches everyone. I mean, it's
Hmm.
really hard if you're open and honest with others about the relationships and that you have with family and friends. I mean, I've found over time there's really almost no one untouched by addiction.
Hmm.
And relative to me, I did not, when I sat down to write a book, I had an idea of a plot line, and that was what I said earlier. I thought, and it really was based on I saw a woman once in the street early on in my sobriety, and for whatever reason, I was it was one of those things you see someone and you're like, I know this person. I have no idea why I know this person. And I imagine she worked somewhere around, this was in Soho, somewhere in Soho. And I imagine she worked around there because I saw her on more than one occasion. And there was just, since then, I've come to believe that sometimes we are just kind of connected in some sort of cosmic way that we don't really understand. You could meet somebody, sit next to them, and not have anything to say. You could sit next to somebody, a complete stranger, and feel like you've known them for lifetimes.
Right.
I never approached this woman or anything else. It was just kind of like a vibe, and that kind of launched this idea. I was like, wow, what if you met somebody and the minute you met them, you remembered that you knew something dangerous was going to happen to them, right? And what would it be like to try to convince them that you weren't just some whack job stalking them, that you truly in your heart of hearts believed, like, I know this bad thing is going to happen to you, and I'm going to, befriend you so I could tell you, because you wouldn't just straight out be like, hey, stranger, something bad's going to happen to you. Then you're the one probably being arrested. If I sat
Right.
down to write the book, as I say, I think let's do some quick math. I had about 2.5 years of sobriety, and
Hmm.
my sobriety, a huge part of my sobriety. There are lots of components, but the biggest component was AA.
Okay.
Yeah, I was in Alcoholics Anonymous. I did do a rehab, and I came out of that rehab 30 days. I was still living in New York City, living in Brooklyn, and I was doing meetings, and I had a sponsor, and I was doing the steps, and all of that was a huge component with me not going back out. But I will tell you, not like any, some alcoholics go into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous and are very at ease with all of it, whether that's the steps or speaking or having to work with, there's no have to, but like wanting to work with a sponsor, having sponsees. I had a lot of questions. I wouldn't even frame them as doubts because I don't think I ever doubted what I was doing. But I definitely felt that there was things about the program that I needed to sort of explore and say out loud, and ultimately say, I ultimately ended up saying in the book. And honestly, when I started to write the book, I had no idea that that's where it was going. I sat down and it just started to spill, and I think it probably needed to, I mean, I think there was just this moment where it was like, this is what this is. And the more I wrote it, the more I realized that I was writing things that had been going on in my head that had been unsaid for those 2 years, at least unsaid in those ways. Because when you're in it, you're in it and you're focused and you're trying to do everything that you can. At least I was trying to do everything that I could to remain sober and not go back to what I really honestly believe was going to be death for me. I mean, I was pretty close.
Right.
And so the demons, it's funny because a lot of books that I think are written about addiction, and there's so many good ones, especially in fiction. There's like this whole addiction fiction sort of niche that's grown and expanded. There's some amazing stories. They focus on like the using days and
Hmm.
and when what's that? There's obviously a lot of great stories to tell in that, but this is the reverse of that. In My Dead Friend Sarah, the lead character, the main character, he is sober and he's within that first year of sobriety. I think he has 9 months, maybe 8 months when the story starts. I can't remember. I haven't read it in a while, but um, there are demons within that first year. You're still people. A lot of people mistakenly assume that like, oh, I stopped drinking and that was the problem. No, you put down the drink and then you actually start getting down to what the real demons, is what we
Right.
call, what I call them, and they're very real. And lying, for instance, like when I got sober, I realized, wow, I was also doing an incredible amount of lying.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I had quit drinking, I found that I had a propensity to tell lies, and they were the most ridiculous, meaningless lies sometimes. And I had to work on that. I ended up getting a therapist. I'm like, I have to stop lying. I have to stop embellishing. I have to stop saying, as a storyteller, I think I had just let embellishment become like a thing that I wanted to do all the time. Oh, I'm going to make this is a good story. If I just add this and this, it'll be a great story. People will be
Right.
telling this story forever. And so, that is a different type of demon. There's so much that you still have to work on when you end up getting sober. And I think that was what this book. Now, I wrote this book, I put it out, I self-published it, I hired a PR firm. I don't really remember how I even found them. And I think the timing was just really good because I worked in advertising. I had somewhat of a name within that industry. Sobriety now, people talk about it a lot more. There's a lot more going
Mm-hmm.
on like Instagram and all the social networks. People are very celebratory of sobriety, I find.
Okay.
But in 2011, 2012, I don't think it was quite there yet. And obviously, social media, while it existed in some form, hadn't really taken off to what we deal with now. I did a lot of radio. I did some interviews in some newspapers, and it was all attached to the idea that like, here's this guy who works in advertising. He's sober now. He's willing to talk about it. Anonymity for me had never been a part of it. I was somebody who had to really talk about my sobriety to keep it. And the book got into a lot of hands that it wouldn't have otherwise. I mean, I had a pretty robust network of friends and coworkers and just acquaintances that I knew probably would take a chance on a first time novel from me. But in the end, I mean, I literally had people reach out to me who read it, complete strangers, who said that it helped them either make the decision to try sobriety or help them within their own early sobriety. And again, I can't say that I sat down and thought, I'm going to write a fiction book, a kind of thriller that deals with alcoholism and addiction in the hopes that it helps other people get sober.
Right.
That
Oh,
it
I understand.
did, obviously meant a ton to me. I mean, the best reviews I ever got for that book are not on Amazon or Goodreads. They were people who reached out, found me, and said, wow, I read your book and it resonated in such a strong way that I'm actually 72 days sober, or, I'm working a program right now. And some of the things you talked about in this book resonated with me in that capacity.
Well, that's
So
good. So
it
let's
was.
go on. Let's go on to your second book because if I have a feeling that we could probably talk about the first one for quite some time, and I want to make sure that we discuss all your books as well. So the next one we have is But I Love You, which I
Hmm.
believe is another thriller.
Hmm.
So where does that take us?
Well, that one I had a very specific idea in my head there, and that was that there are a lot of horrible people on the planet, right?
Right.
And and what was amazing to me within the circles that I ran in, again, pre-sobriety, post-sobriety, was like, wow, it's amazing how much rope we give people who are not, they're not murderers, they're not thieves per se. Oh, some of them might be thieves, honestly, but
Right.
they're just, and myself included, like there's shades of gray. There's a spectrum of like bad. But I thought it would be a really interesting challenge to see if I couldn't write a story around nothing but really horrible people, a very believable New York City kind of horrible,
Mm-hmm.
and make readers have empathy for them, introduce empathy for them, find a way to make you root for maybe even the most horrible character within the books. And
Right.
I don't, I'm not the first person to try to do that. I think that's something that probably is done often. But that was what I set down to do. And again, as I was writing it, it probably came to me after or during. I was just like, this is me kind of working out relationships, the relationships that I had and was still clinging to that I needed to let go. There was a lot of people who, you could call them a variety of different things, energy vampires, or there's just, again, I mean, there's a lot of recovery and sobriety in all the work that I've put out thus far because they're important to me. And a big part of that is actually figuring out, you know, the relationships that are actually a two-way street, right?
Mm-hmm.
And trying to cut ties with people who honestly you might love them for whatever reasons, a whole host of reasons, but so I don't know. I would say it's really that is what it's about. But I Love You is about the most horrible people you've ever loved.
So I'm taking the book takes place in New York City from what you said.
Yeah.
Where does that book like if I open it up and open the book up and I'm starting to read, what am I reading? What am I reading about? Because there's a whole slew of situations that horrible people, like my three books I've written is based around a guy that gets into selling and dealing drugs and creating a drug empire through the urban country lives. That's not the nicest and most upstanding character you come to.
Hmm.
So when you say horrible people, what kind of horrible people are you discussing? What kind of situations happen? Because again, But I Love You might be misconstrued as it's a romance with horrible people trying to fall in love or things like that.
Right.
I mean, from what between the title and what you're saying.
Right. Well, I mean, it is a romance. There's romance baked into it, and I mean, basically, one of the main characters is in love uh, with a woman who is not in love with her, and that woman runs basically a very exclusive single service. All
All
right.
right.
So again, like this book, probably written right on the cusp of things like OK Cupid, or there used to be a company called Urban Signals that connected people, strangers. There
Mhm.
there was online dating at the time, but what I had done, because I was actually I was doing ads for one of those services, is I met the owner of one of those businesses that catered to a richer clientele.
All right.
Okay, you're single. We're going to get you together. I met with her on a handful of times to try to help develop like branding ideas and advertising around the thing. And I just realized I'm like, wow, she was horrible. She was doing it for all the wrong reasons. You know,
Right.
she didn't really care about making lifelong connections. She identified a niche and she went hard into it. And she was a brilliant conversationalist. She was a brilliant presenter. There was many, many amazing things that she was. But I don't actually think at the end of the day that her heart was in it for any of the right reasons, in terms of pairing people with their soulmates. So that is a horrible character. Another horrible. I mean, within this, it goes all the way to having, somebody who is willing to cause physical harm to people just for money. Obviously, that's a fairly standard kind of horrible. I don't know. I don't want to give too much away about any one of
Right.
the characters as I'm thinking it through. But
Right, but it does give us kind
ultimately,
of an insight about the story a little bit, and that's where I wanted to get into because, like I said, horrible people is just a huge range of variations. So it sounds like the it's like you said a romance and it's a conflict of many different types of conflicts of people that aren't really upstanding, as you said, horrible people coming together and going through that. So now let's go on to the third book, if we may. So, because you said that was the newest one and you really liked talking about that. So let's go into that because we all have the last book fresh in our mind and easy to discuss. So tell me a bit about it. Where do we start off with it? And oh, criminy, I just forgot the name of it off the top, even though
Oh,
you just said it.
that's all
So
right.
where do we start off with it? Where's the
Well, the
book? Oh,
book,
page one start off.
page one, it's called Future Skinning, and it starts off. You are right in the thick of it with the main character. His name is Casey. He is in a hotel room that you wouldn't wish on, your worst enemy. He is sitting across a table that he's just pulled together. The table is loaded with all sorts of food, fast food mostly. I mean, everything from pizza to donut holes to weight gain powder. There are fried everything. I mean, if you can fry it, it's on the table. And he's sitting across from another man, and there's a woman, his girlfriend, Lillian, is also in the room. And what he's doing in that moment is actually binge eating, because what it is he is what you come to find out is that he's a devout anorexic who can actually see the future by binge eating.
All
And
right.
it opens with you right there, pretty much eating and smelling every bite. We're talking about in the thousands of calories.
Mm-hmm.
And I have read that chapter. I've been lucky enough to have a few different bookstores invite me to do readings on this, and a couple of the schools that are around here where I live. And I wrote it and I wanted it to feel really bad and thick. And I hoped that I hoped that people would want to stop reading it, because I thought it was necessary to kind of communicate that sort of misery, which really, again, it's sort of born from the idea of like trying to give somebody some sort of taste of what it might be like for somebody who is participating in that kind of eating for any reason, which doesn't really matter if you're anorexic, bulimic, or if you have any disordered eating or eating disorders. I think we've all been guilty of overeating
Right.
and what that can feel like. And fortunately, most people who have read the book stick around long enough to get past that very uncomfortable moment, to take the rest of the ride with Casey and everybody else in that book. That's how it opens.
All right. So I'm actually very curious on why did you choose an eating disorder for Future Skinny to be the focus, like you said, the person, Casey, can tell the future after binge eating
Hmm.
and going through the whole process. It's odd to have that as the characters, or at least from my understanding. But again, this is thriller, which is a genre I don't dive into very often.
Hmm.
So my perspective is it seems odd. Why did you choose that route to go?
Well, I in my life, as a addict and alcoholic, so pre-sobriety and post-sobriety, I basically participated in what I think would be clinically referred to these days as disordered eating. Okay,
All right.
so I don't think that I ever had technically an eating disorder. I don't believe that I was ever officially anorexic or bulimic, especially because I now know those people and have
Hmm.
friends who truly were. But there were times when I participated in massive schemes that I concocted myself, because of my own obsession with my thinness. I graduated from college in 1995. I moved to New York City to work in advertising. I ate horribly. I picked up weight very fast. I didn't have a lot of money. I probably put on like 30 pounds, which on my frame, is or isn't a lot. It's really all relative, right?
Right.
But for me, it was uncomfortable. I did not like the way that I looked. I managed to meet a friend of mine who worked across from me. He had all of a sudden he just started looking great. I'll be honest with you. I think he was working out, probably was part of it, but the other thing that he was doing was he said, "Hey, have you read that book, Sugar Busters?" This was a book that came out, I think, in the late aughts. Maybe it came out as late as like 20. I'm sorry, I'm not the early aughts. I think it came out in the late 90s. And he either gave me a copy, like right before I got on a plane. I moved from New York City to Atlanta, Georgia, to take a different job. And I became obsessed with it, like anything. I mean, I was just like, oh, here's the roadmap to getting thin, cutting out sugar, cutting out carbs. I started running. I left New York City and put myself in a place with my wife at the time. And that removed a lot of the alcoholic symptoms, right? I didn't have as many bars to go to. I didn't have as many alcoholic friends to hang out with. I reinvented myself as sort of like a health nick. And cut to like, I don't know, maybe 10 months into it, I went back to New York City. I had lost all the weight, probably had lost more than that 30 pounds. I don't really remember what my weight was at the time. But everybody in New York City who I saw while I was interviewing for a job to get back there was like, "Wow, you look great. Wow, you're so thin. You look amazing. You look great." I have one friend, he was a former boss of mine, and I sat with him, and even he was like, "You're looking really good." But then about 15 minutes into the lunch that we were having, he was like, "Are you okay? Because you don't have cancer, do you?" And it was kind of crazy because I was simultaneously like, "No, dude, don't. I'm so thank you for asking." And it came off almost like a compliment in my head. I was like, "Wow, I'm looking so thin. He thinks I have cancer." I was like romanticizing it a bit, if that makes sense. It's kind of
Right.
And I would then go on to sort of for as long as I could restrict the amount of food that I ate. I was on a very ridiculously low caloric intake outside of booze because I did eventually move back to Manhattan. And I started drinking more often and I started drinking more. And it's pretty hard to limit your caloric intake if you're drinking beer. There's a lot of calories in beer. And I hatched all sorts of schemes around that. Like I was still running. If I went out and I drank more than, I can't remember if it was 2 or 3. I want to say it was like, I would allow myself to have 2 beers. If I had a third beer, the next day I had to run another mile. If I had a fourth beer, that was 2 more miles. 5 beers, 3 more miles. So if I was out drinking very big, the next day I would get up and no matter how bad I felt, I would go out and run because I was obsessed with maintaining a weight that honestly wasn't healthy. And this is the one time where my alcoholism probably saved me before it then tried to kill me itself because I couldn't keep up. The alcohol, my desire to drink and booze ultimately became an impediment to practicing disordered eating in order to keep my weight. Now, in sobriety, there have been times where my own body dysmorphia had led me to do the same thing, but for much shorter periods of time because I have a network of friends and I also have all these tools. And so, I have therapists, whatever. I've done it all and I do it all. But in 2014, I lost a job. My wife was pregnant. I had a kid coming. She was still working. And I started running. I was already still running, but in a healthy way. With all that time on my hands, I fell back into some patterns. I started running just because I could. I was running farther and farther. Some days I would just run a half marathon for no reason other than what else am I going to do? I noticed I started to lose weight. My wife was saying, "Hey, she has her own issues revolving around weight and appearance." And she, "Oh, you're looking really good." And it started to click again where I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, what can I control here? I can't get the job. I was still licking my wounds on that. I can control the way that I look. And people will think that I look good if I'm very thin and wiry and tan because I've been running outside, whatever." There was some thing. I checked myself pretty quickly. I was like, "You know what? No, this is not good." I think at that time, two things had happened. One, I had a good friend who very much was clinically an anorexic and probably a bulimic. And I was somewhat fascinated with her ability to pull it off, to be completely honest. I thought, wow, this is amazing that you're able to do that in your own way and still be healthy, come off as healthy, very successful. very loved by everybody, etc. I went to a bookstore because I wanted to read more about the disease of anorexia itself. And when I got to the bookstore, there was plenty on. I mean, not plenty. There was, I would say, somewhere between a half dozen and a dozen books. All of them were written with, most of them were biography, autobiography. I don't believe there was anything fiction. I'm sure somewhere within the realm of fiction books, there was characters that dealt with those issues. But the books that I found, they were all about women. And I thought, well, it's interesting. How many men are anorexic? How many men are dealing with body dysmorphia? How many men have these types of issues? A quick Google search said that 15% of anorexics were male. I figured it, this is in 20, what is this, 2012, 2013, 14 maybe. I was like, you know what, then if it says 15%, it's more. It's definitely more. If 15% answered that they were, okay.
Yeah.
I had another male friend who was recently sober, and I started talking to him more often because of his sobriety. And it came to find out that he was having a lot of the same issues around his weight and the way that he looked and the way that he saw himself that I was. And I thought, well, maybe I should write a book that has this, that incorporates this in some way. Some years prior to that, when I had first met my current wife, she and I had engaged in a meal that was ridiculously large. We were early on in the courting process, I guess you'd call it, or dating, whatever. And we let our guard down. We had this huge Italian meal. We ate more than we ever had eaten in front of each other. Multiple main courses, desserts, tons of bread. I mean, the amount of bread that we ate in and of itself was ridiculous. And we left that date, that night, together. I felt horrible. I was so full, but I was happy.
Right.
It didn't matter. I was like, I don't need to be concerned about how I look because this person loves me. I love her and she loves me. It was strong. We were walking underneath the Williamsburg Bridge in Brooklyn, and all of a sudden I was overcome by a very powerful déjà vu. There was a bus approaching. I don't remember any other details than being under the bridge, the bus approaching, me walking with her and being very full. This déjà vu hits. In that moment, I thought, wow, wouldn't it be weird if all it took to see the future was just eating too much? So I had that as a notion rolling around in my head for a while, and I married it to everything I was going through in 2014 related to my own disordered eating and just kind of obsession with my body image. And that's how Future Skinny was born. So,
all right. So how does it become a horror in the sense of what? Because to me, horror screams somebody's coming at. Yeah, they have the killer. Thrillers are just, you have the killers, you have conflict, you have fighting, things like that. So I can see the thriller portion of it, or a supernatural thriller. Where does the horror section of it come into? Because I have plenty of friends that are into horror, and I see what they kind of get into.
yeah, I mean, horror right now, it's actually, I spend a lot of time following a lot of different authors and independent publishers on Twitter. And what is and isn't horror is actually has been a pretty big topic of conversation this year and even last year. Because I think a lot of people do traditionally think, no, horror means that there's a killer, horror means that there's a monster, horror means that there's a killer who is a monster. Think of a lot of Stephen King, but you could refer to my book as psychological horror. I think you could refer to my book as a genre of horror that I would say it's adjacent to as body horror, which really is just kind of like something revolving around body. I mean, there are a lot of people within the LG. I always blow that.
I understand and I always mispronounce it myself. So, but
cut that part out.
Yeah. So in that community, there's obviously
there is this whole. I mean, like I, as a white, straight, old man, have been recently introduced to so many amazing new storytellers from within that community who are writing these fantastic fictional horror narratives around the very real psychological things that they have experienced within their lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are going to be some people, honestly, friends of mine, even my parents, they would probably say, well, that's not really a horror book, because they would think, much like, people grabbed my dead friend Sarah and said, oh, this is going to have ghosts in it.
Right.
Oh, this is not horror. I have had, you know, not the easiest time in the world pinpointing, hey, where does Future Skinny fit in the world? If I have to, if you publish a book and you put it on Amazon, Amazon is going to ask you or allow you to say, it's this, or that, right?
Right.
Maybe I think 2 or 3 things, right? And it is a little bit of everything. I had a review early on from Midwest Book Review, and in that, the reviewer said, this is, it was a lovely review. And at the end of it, she said that it was a book that couldn't be identified by any singular genre, that it hopped through many of them. I was very nervous about referring to it as a piece of horror. But I think, to me, what I've come to think of as acceptable for horror lately is, if you read a book and you feel that this person is engaged in something that is crippling and terrible,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't have to have, ghosts and and trust me, I love those types of books too. I love a good slasher. I love a good
Right.
I like a lot of horror movies. I was very nervous to even refer to it, and so honestly I didn't, and I'm surprised that I actually referred to it as a horror book with you, because I think only recently have I felt confident enough, uh, with some conversations and maybe some additional reviews that came in the meantime, to say there are elements of horror within this book. And I think that's just because what the person is going through is horrifying. I mean, at the end of the day, it is a horrifying journey that he is on. And really, when you think about horror that's happening around us in the world, I mean, there's plenty of horror happening,
Oh yeah.
right? But none of it involves fictional monsters. Well, maybe some of it does. That would be awesome if that's actually happening, really. But in a weird way, I could get into that. But do you know what I mean? I just think what horror can and can't be, we shouldn't we shouldn't rely on, we shouldn't make it fit within this idea that, like, oh, it has to, have Freddy Krueger in it or something to quantify it.
Right. So okay. And now, so it's not the typical slasher horror, the thriller kind of keep you on your toes, keep the heart racing kind of horror. So I understand. I can see where you're going with the. It's bringing the fear, mental, psychological fear into the novel or the book to be able to get people to get their heart racing, feel the anguish and all this. So
Yeah.
makes sense. So with Casey going into this, what I mean, I have to imagine there's more to him just being able to see the future. Something has to happen that conflicts with the eating disorder and his seeing the future. What do you kind of, let's say, just getting him started, what does he step into that actually brings the novel to life?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, he meets a woman,
Hmm.
and he falls for her pretty quickly. And what happens is, while he's dating her, and he sort of realizes that he can see the future by eating too much, because, like I said, similar to me, in those early days, he's eating with her. He eats a lot, more than he's ever allowed himself to eat probably in decades. And he has a vision, and that vision it comes to fruition the very next day. What he saw happens.
Right.
And when he realizes that, he can't really let it go. He decides he has to try it again. Like, what would cause that? I think it might have been the eating. I'm going to do it again. Ultimately, he is so driven to protect this woman, who it turns out is running from an abusive spouse. And he comes to figure that, well, maybe I could turn this into a thing where we make good money. If I could read futures legitimately, maybe we could charge money for it. And she probably initially is not into it, but comes to think, all right, fine, let's go that route. And they start basically, he starts reading futures for other people for cash. At a certain point, he is playing around with the idea of like wanting to see farther into the future. And, you know, just on a simple hypothetical math, he decides, well, maybe that's really just no harder than eating more. If I push myself to eat even more. As he's doing that and experimenting with that, he actually ends up having a vision of her, this new girlfriend of his, Lillian, committing a murder. And he decides not to tell her about it.
All right.
Now, when that comes to fruition, just I think 2 or 3 days later, within the story, he realizes that that was a pretty bad decision. Now she's killed a person. They have to get in contact with her abusive ex because he is somebody that can help with a situation like that. And ultimately, he agrees in exchange for help in cleaning up her mess to basically be the personal psychic of this pretty horrible West Texas gun runner is basically what her ex is. And, you know, that launches the rest of the story, you know, that sort of journey that he's going to go on after that. And a big part of it, and I think really the horror that I hope people relate to is like, this is the last thing in the world he wants to do is eat, because you can only eat so much with and maintain a certain weight. You can exercise yourself into the ground, you can turn to bulimia, but ultimately in his situation, there's going to be an end to it. And so, you know, take yourself out of the eating part of it for a minute. In fact, when I was pitching this book early on, I kept saying to people, I was like, imagine everything that you ever wanted was as easy as doing the one thing you swore you never would.
Right.
And that's at the crux of it. And I think that's actually probably why a lot of people who have read the book thus far have really enjoyed it, because, you know, or have had it resonate with them. I don't know if anyone's enjoyed it. I think people are enjoying it. But it's a hard story to enjoy. That we spend so much time thinking like, wow, if X, Y, or Z would just happen, my life would be so much better. It would all be figured out. If I met the perfect girl, if I had the perfect job, if I all of a sudden had $10 million. This is really like, hey, all those things are right there. All you got to do is this thing that you swore you'd never do. And in his case, that's eating a lot. It could be, you know, and I just think the horror, again, really comes from like truly trying to bring to life just how difficult and how much mental duress that causes a person like him in this situation.
I understand. I mean, it sounds like all 3 books would be something to keep somebody on their toes and definitely bring out a whole lot of different conversational topics that a lot of people do avoid.
Yeah.
So, with that being said, we've been talking for, I think, about 40, 45 minutes. I don't want to take up a horrible amount of your time.
No worries.
Because I appreciate you being on. Where do you want people to find you? So if they don't want to go to authorblurb.com, where I have all your links, all your information that you've given me, where do you prefer them to find you?
Well, you can find me on Instagram just at Peter Rosch. You can find me on Twitter, also at Peter Rosch. You can find me at peterrosch.com. And if you want to see what books and read a little bit more and see what people thought, then I just recommend going to Goodreads and looking at what some people have said about all 3 books there. Or you can even just write me at peterrosch@gmail.com and say, hey, man, what's wrong with you?
I understand. And I think I have all but the email, all the links for the social medias and websites in the show notes and on authorblurb.com. So with that being said, people can go there, find you, get in touch with you. I appreciate you being here. It was a pleasure talking with you. this is going to be the end of the conversation for everybody else. But if you hold on for me, we'll talk a little bit more.
Thank you, man. It was a pleasure being on the show. I
Thank you.
appreciate it.